Hello, this is my second history presentation. This one is on a period in early chemistry, which we know as alchemy. That character there is a character from an anime called Full Metal Alchemist. It's really great, so just a shout out to that. If you ever feel like watching some anime, that's a good one. So the first thing here, I'm going to talk about what alchemy is. We consider it a proto-science. The word proto, the prefix there means first or foremost. You might think of like a prototype, which is the first model of something, or protozoans, which are really early animals on Earth. So when we say proto-science, we mean that it's like a very, very early science. And then there are some differences between proto-sciences and what we would consider to be like modern actual science. And a lot of that is that proto-sciences have to deal with magic and mythology and things like that. So they didn't fully understand what was going on. So a lot of times they invoked things like gods or magic or something like that to explain the things that they were seeing. And so alchemy was kind of like that. So you can see there will be a lot of things as I go through this presentation where you can see that it's not exactly a fully scientific endeavor. But it is something that's like a first stepping stone in getting towards a more modern understanding of chemistry. And so something that's pretty interesting is they were doing some things in alchemy which we still hold out today. You know, they were looking at ways that reactions took place. They were discovering some elements even through this alchemy, and so we still hold some of that knowledge in the chemistry that we have today, but most of it is no longer accepted. So to understand why people were doing this, you have to understand the main goals that people had in alchemy, and really, they weren't really, intellectual type goals. Most of them were kind of greed-driven. So the biggest goal of alchemy was to create something that's called the Philosopher's Stone. The Philosopher's Stone was this substance they thought which could purify things, and by purifying things, it'd do things like turning other metals into gold, or giving people everlasting life. And to understand this, they didn't have a full understanding of metals like we do today. So they thought that metals like copper and tin and things like that were just impure metals, and then things like gold and silver were getting to be more and more pure. And so they thought if you could purify copper, it would eventually turn into silver, and if you could purify that even further, it would turn into gold. And similarly, they thought that human beings, as they lived through their lives, became distorted or impure, and they thought that if we could purify ourselves, that things that happened when our bodies deteriorate when we get old could be reversed. And so is this big idea with that, this trend going from things that are impure to being pure that led them to think these sorts of things. And you can see, if you look back at the first history presentation that I gave on paleochemistry, with processes like smelting, they did have some purification processes. They could take that copper oxide, that green sort of useless copper, and they could smelt it and turn it into like useful, clean, good copper. And so they saw these chemical processes where purification was possible, and they just thought that they could take this to the very, very extreme and create gold or create everlasting life. And to them, that was something that was very desirable. So a lot of that really drove people to experiment in alchemy and try and figure things out. As a vocab word, there's this word transmutation, and it is when you take one element and you turn it into another element. This was sort of a very common thought in alchemy, and so people thought that you could, take elements and turn them into other things. What's interesting is this word still exists in science today, but only in a very specialized place. With radioactive decay and nuclear fission and fusion, we can have transmutation occur where one element will turn into another element. The thing is, this is it's a very dangerous process. It releases radiation always. It's hard to control what's going on and things like that. And so, we can't actually turn iron into gold in this method. And the things that we can do, usually things like producing nuclear energy, produce a significant amount of waste, and we can only do them with certain types of chemicals, such as like uranium, special isotopes of uranium and things like that. The last goal here is kind of similar to the Philosopher's Stone. It's called the Elixir of Life, and it worked on a similar principle. It was just something that you would drink, and it would rejuvenate you. While it's not connected to alchemy, there are a lot of different myths that go with things like this. If you think about like the Fountain of Youth, that's another thing that where it grants youth and rejuvenation to older people. And I think the idea is just that, you know, people sort of like this romantic idea of being able to become young again, because when you're getting older and dying, you know, that's sad. And so people want longer lives, people want, you know, lots of money, things like that. That's why they're doing these things. So where alchemy really got its start was in a city called Alexandria. Alexandria is in Egypt, but it was really part of the Greek and Roman empires. And so what happened is there were lots and lots of scholars in this city. There was a great library there called the Library of Alexandria, and life was a little bit different than it is today, because, you know, right now we can communicate over the internet and we can publish a paper here and we can send it all over the world immediately. But back in that day, you know, it was hard. There weren't printing presses. If you wanted a book, you had to copy it by hand and things like that. And so it was a lot more efficient for scholars, if they were going to be communicating with each other, to all live nearby. And so at least as far as the Western world is concerned, Alexandria was the place to live if you were an intellectual. It was the place that you would go and move. And so that's why alchemy sort of developed in this environment, because you had a lot of thinkers sort of in this one place at one time trying to figure things out. What's interesting is in ancient Greece, there were 4 elements that they thought existed: earth, air, fire, and water. And you know, we can see that that's not entirely right, but they used that as a premise for a lot of their thoughts. And you know, eventually they developed new elements, which I'll kind of talk about later, but that's how that went. Getting back to the protoscience part of this, alchemy, as I said, it had some element of mythology, and something that went along with that was that when the Greeks moved into Egypt, rather than trying to displace the Egyptian gods, what they did was they tried to sort of mix their gods together so that the people wouldn't get as upset when they were moving into Egypt. And so what they did, one god that was sort of a hybrid god was this god called Hermes Trismegistus, which it stands for the thrice great Hermes, which actually was a mix between the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth. And so this was really the god, this Hermes Trismegistus was the god that was in charge of alchemy. And so whenever they saw this sort of magic happen in front of them, they attributed it to this god. And so if they wanted luck in alchemy, they would, you know, praise this god and worship him and things like that. The basic things that they're focusing on here, because I talked about the goals of alchemy, and really, practically speaking, we never achieved anything like the Philosopher's Stone or the Elixir of Life or anything like that. But there were some practical things that were happening. So metallurgy, I mentioned here, dyeing and making gemstones. And so if you look at this, these are all things that are actually really economically profitable processes. And so really the thing that was driving alchemy and the study of alchemy is that it was economically something that was very, very beneficial to the people who were doing it. And so if you could create better, pure metals, if you could dye clothes, I've mentioned before that that different pigments that you could use to dye clothes was very valuable, because everybody sort of had, you know, brown clothes before that. And so it was, you know, having colorful clothes was actually a very lucrative sort of business. You know, making pearls and gemstones and things like that, you can see how that would be economically something that would make you a lot of money. And so that was kind of why they were doing what they were doing, is that they wanted to have more money. So after the period of time in Alexandria, and actually I should mention the library in Alexandria burned down. That was where like a lot of knowledge was kept, and I think that actually that was one of the greatest travesties in all history in terms of the loss of knowledge that occurred. And eventually, scholars moved out of that area and moved into other places. And I'll talk here about the Middle East and the Golden Age of Islam because I think that's something that doesn't get widely considered. If you look at the date range here, this is when Europe would be sort of considered in the Middle Ages. And so lots of times people consider this the Dark Ages, and historians would say like nothing was going on during this time and stuff like that. But realistically speaking, things were going on, they just weren't happening in Europe. So Europe was in this period of decline where there wasn't a lot of intellectual development and there wasn't a lot of progress in a lot of different ways. They just had these small little feudal states, and they were having wars between different kingdoms, and the church was suppressing a lot of intellectual development and things like that. And so Europe wasn't doing much, but that's not to say that nothing was happening in other parts of the world. And so alchemy actually had been, the study of alchemy had actually moved to the Middle East, and it was being developed there. And actually, the word alchemy itself, while it describes what was happening in Alexandria earlier on, it actually comes from an Arabic word, which is alchemia. So the developments that were happening during this time were so important that it actually gave the name to what this practice is, and actually eventually morphed into what we call chemistry today, because the word chemistry comes from the word alchemy. Same root word there. So this person pictured off here to the right is a man. I'm not good at pronouncing things, but I'll try it. Jabir ibn Hayyan. And so in Europe they called him just Jaber because they couldn't pronounce it, kind of like me. But I still think that was not a very good intellectual process to just give him his own like European version of his name. I think calling him by his actual name would have been a little bit more historically accurate. But in any case, he's a really influential guy because he started to think about alchemy, and he sort of changed how it was done. Rather than basing it on gods and mythology and things like that, he thought that we should employ a sort of scientific methodology, and so like using things like controlled experimentation and things like that to try and figure things out. And so you can see that this person was talking about going from something that was more mystical and based on mythology to something that was way more like chemistry. And so a lot of people would consider this person to be sort of the father of modern chemistry, because he took alchemy from what it was and turned it into a more practical science. And so during this period of the Golden Age of Islam, this is where we actually get the first split here between alchemists and what we would call chemists, so scientists and these proto-scientists. And what was happening by the end is that the chemists were looking at the things that the alchemists were saying, and the chemists were saying, like, your ideas are bad, you're basing it all on this mythology, but there are actually these practical things that we can understand. And they were developing ideas, scientific ideas, and so this is kind of where chemistry came from, is this period of time. Also, in addition to the original Greek elements of earth, air, fire, and water, they found some different elements. They said sulfur, mercury, and salt. Sulfur and mercury are both actually elements. Salt, not an element, but it's a compound that's kind of difficult to separate, and so that's probably why they thought that it was. Alrighty, so what's happening in Europe at this time, as I said, it's in the medieval time, so Europe isn't doing much, but they are seeing all the great developments that are going on in the Middle East, and so they wanted to prosper from some of those developments, and so what happened is they translated a lot of the texts from Arabic and brought them back to Europe. And I should point out that they're not making a whole lot of progress on their own, but they are borrowing the ideas from other people and trying to employ them. And so what we get here is sort of a trade of knowledge that's happening where knowledge is flowing into Europe from the Middle East. Mostly the drive in alchemy in Europe in this time is to produce gold, and that's generally speaking what it is still for the alchemist for a long time. Again, they have this desire to have extreme wealth and extremely long life and things like that. So this thing happened in Europe where the Catholic Church is becoming really, really powerful, the most powerful political entity in all of Europe, and they see the things that people are doing with alchemy, and they are finding problems with it. One of them is that alchemy is all about purification and finding this philosopher's stone to purify yourself, purify your soul, things like that. And the Catholic Church says, if you're trying to purify your soul, God is the way of accomplishing that. And so the Catholic Church starts to look down on these alchemists and what they're doing and says, like, this is sort of a work of the devil or something along those lines. And so what's going on is alchemists are becoming less and less trusted in time. It's kind of funny. In England, Henry IV, he passed this law that said that you couldn't multiply metals, which actually meant that you couldn't turn other metals into gold. Funny because you can't actually do that, so there's this law in the books that forbids you to do this impossible thing. It'd be like, I don't know, saying, like passing a law that says, like, you can't just, like, fly around on your own, like, or, I don't know, just other impossible things. It's funny to have a law that prevents it. So, anyway, what's also additionally interesting about this is that you could buy a license to multiply metal, but again, it was impossible. So people paid the King of England money so that they could have the chance to make gold out of other things, but it was not actually something that people could do. So I don't know. Funny the way that people thought back then. During the Renaissance, which followed the Middle Ages, and so Renaissance meaning rebirth, it's really like, it's the reacceptance of like classical type of thought, Greek and Roman thought, into modern European thought. As we're going into this period of time, people are seeing that alchemists are not really right about a lot of things, and alchemists, because of like the negative thoughts that were coming out about them in the Middle Ages, were coming to be looked down upon, as I had said, and so people are thinking of them as like thieves and tricksters and things like that. And what ends up happening is they sort of become really disrespected. There's some special branches of alchemy that come out. Medical would work in like things with like doctors and things like that. Pharmaceuticals, making drugs, although the drugs that they created are not necessarily, they're not like the drugs that we create today where they go through extensive testing and that make sure that it helps you and doesn't do any harm. It was kind of hit or miss with these Renaissance pharmaceuticals. It'd be like a tonic that you would take, and it might kill you and it might make you better, and it's kind of hard to know. People were just desperate, so they went to these pharmaceutical alchemists for things. Occult alchemists would like maybe put a curse on people or something like that, if you had wanted, or something mystical along those lines. Entrepreneurial alchemists, those are the ones that are creating gemstones and fake golds and silvers and things like that and selling them. So they're just trying to make money. But it's not really a big focus. So these are some specialized sorts of things that are coming out of alchemy, but it's not really a big focus. Now, as time goes on, the chemists are sort of taking over and gaining respect. As I said, it's kind of more true science. We're getting closer to the Age of Enlightenment here, and so people are starting to think more empirically about science, and they're being less sort of mystical in terms of thinking about the gods. And so alchemy in this period of time is really sort of dying off, and the alchemists, people don't think of them in the same way as they used to, and so it's kind of the tragic end fate of alchemy. All right, that is that. If you have any questions about any of this, come in and ask, or if you want to research further, there's lots of interesting information on the internet, things like that, and so, let me know.